Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Ryan Suter. I'm one of the senior investment managers here at Sharewise, and we're here this afternoon with CEO Jason Carroll. Now, Jason's been kind enough to lend us his time and expertise to discuss his company, Tryptamine Therapeutics. So we're going to start things off with a presentation from Jason, and then he's going to hand it back over to me to run the traditional Q&A. So obviously, I've got a couple of questions that we'll start things off with the Q&A. And then, ladies and gentlemen, if you have any questions you'd like me to ask to Jason, please submit them through using the Q&A function of Zoom. Jason, thank you again for your time, mate. It's all yours.
Thanks very much, Ryan. I really appreciate the time, and thanks everyone for joining. I'd like to talk to you about...
Jason, just quickly, that's
pulled
up your presenter view rather than the typical...
presenter view. Sorry, thank you for that.
You're right.
I knew there was going to be a mild hiccup. There always is.
Here we go.
Okay. I'm going to speak to you about precision psychedelic therapy. And most people, when they look at what they've heard, at least, about psychedelic therapy, is they question whether or not there's any precision actually available in this area at all. And in fact, there are many ways to be able to show the right data, to be able to get listened to by health authorities, and to be able to work towards an effective way to get registration and reimbursement, not just here in Australia, but in other regulatory authorities around the world. Tryptamine Therapeutics is a clinical stage drug development company, actually developing a very innovative and scalable IV infusion of what's called psilocin. Now, for those that have ever heard of psilocybin, psilocin is the product inside psilocybin that does all the work inside the brain, causes what we call a neuroplastic state, which I'll talk to you a bit about that later, and it has the ability to address unmet clinical needs, and usually those are treatment-resistant medical needs in the area of mental health. Briefly, I'll touch on an infusion, because most people would say, well, how do you take these products? We've only ever heard of psychedelics being used through a capsule. We know there's some other things being used around injections and things like that. So what is an infusion, and how does that actually work? Tryptamine Therapeutics is the first organization in the world to actually run a continuous infusion of the active ingredient in psilocybin, that's psilocin, over a period of time. And this is over a period of 140 to 150 minutes, first of which to reach a loading zone of patients over a 20 to 30 minute period, and then to run for about 2 hours with a continuous infusion of psilocin to allow that patient to progress to, again, what we call a neuroplastic or an altered state. Some people would say a psychedelic state, but I'll explain to you a bit more about why that terminology isn't necessarily the way things are known today. Some of the investment highlights of the organization so far, we believe we're actually pioneering a precision approach to psychedelics. It's trying to bring understanding and metrics to a very subjective field historically, which makes a lot of difference when it comes to looking at what the TGA, what the FDA and the EMEA are looking for in terms of how they can move to the next step and register and approve psychedelic medicines or psychedelic pharmaceuticals, as we'll be working with them on. By targeting precise blood levels of circulating psilocin, we won't need to give them the subjective measures that they often have, the mystical questionnaires and those things that really have been put together almost 50 years ago in terms of way of measuring someone's subjective feeling of intensity or their subjective feeling of what I can see or can't see. This allows you to really put the science around the technology by getting pharmacokinetic data from the blood, by getting EEG data with 50 or so different areas of the brain where you can measure electrical activity in the brain, and then know exactly when a patient is in a state that will allow them to start reworking and rewiring their brain, which really is what this is all about. Uses very scalable intellectual property. The actual idea of an infusion is proprietary to Tryptamine Therapeutics. A number of companies are trying injections, which have a lot of side effects because it's a very, very short amount of time. No one else can use a 2-hour infusion, whether that be with psilocybin, whether that be with psilocin. We have the proprietary technology around using an infusion for this particular group of products. We're also looking at areas with which no one else has entered to find out how effective psilocin IV will be, or psilocybin oral, which is our earlier product. We've done a number of studies within the US, and I'll just bring up a pointer so I can help to show you that. But you're looking at areas such as the University of Florida being one, and they are the #1 organization when it comes to looking at binge eating disorder and eating disorders in general. So very, very strong. And when we actually did a phase 2 data study on binge eating disorder, what we saw was an 80% reduction in episodes of binge eating. And this wasn't just a flash in the pan. This was no matter whether the patients felt they were binge eating twice a day or twice a week. The 6 patients that actually had results come through this study, and we only did the study in 6, was they all had a requisite decrease of around 80%. So from where they started to where they finished, which is actually quite remarkable. And it's something that I'd never seen in pharmaceuticals before in my 3 decades working with J&J, Bristol Myers Squibb, and Inova. Never seen that sort of data reduction before. Looking at University of Michigan in fibromyalgia, we had looked at putting 10 patients through this through oral psilocybin to see a pilot whether it would work. We planned to put 10 patients through because we expected around about 50% response rate, because fibromyalgia is notoriously difficult to treat. And if you have or know anyone that's ever had fibromyalgia, you would know exactly what I mean. It's not just about the chronic pain that people go through. It's the brain fog that they get, forgetting where their keys are, forgetting that they had breakfast this morning, not wanting to go outside because they cannot get themselves out of bed, and knowing that you could be in for an even worse attack tomorrow, in 10 minutes, in 1 hour. And it's the fear and anxiety that goes with that pain that prevents people from getting out into life again. And that affects up to 1 million Australians every single year. And these are very, very poorly treated by existing therapies. So 75% of these patients don't have anything they can turn to. And often that means they turn to prescription antidepressants, they turn to pregabalin, which has very nasty side effects that go along with it, or they turn to high-dose opioids. And I was just seeing an article yesterday around 2022, 2,400 or so accidental deaths that were attributed to those 3 products. It's quite scary to think that these are mums and dads just trying to treat their own conditions, and they had no desire to end their life, but their medications just got to the point that they were mixed in the wrong way. And that's what happens with people with this sort of chronic pain. In fibromyalgia and binge eating disorder, these are people that have depression, they have PTSD. 20% of binge eating disorder sufferers have attempted to take their own lives. So these are very serious mental conditions that we're dealing with. This isn't just someone walking and saying, oh, that person looks overweight. You don't know what secret they have. And that secret can be they have binge eating disorder. Easy to recognize anorexia nervosa, some people would say. Very difficult to understand bulimia or binge eating disorder. And these all follow a certain spectrum. So who we're dealing with the University of Michigan are exceptional when it comes to treating fibromyalgia. And the latest study we have is Harvard University, or Massachusetts General Hospital, which is the oldest university of Harvard. And they're doing a phase 2A study in irritable bowel syndrome for us. They are paying for this study and using our support. So they really wanted to do a study in that gut-brain axis, which we also hypothesized would have a significant impact on patients with IBS. So you can imagine 3 conditions I've talked about today are ones that do not have an effective treatment that can be used. They just simply do not. So trying to find ways to help those patients is paramount. And obviously there's a lot of unmet need there. Very quickly, I know I have 2 dots here, and that's very unfortunate. So I'm going to get rid of at least one of those if I can. Okay. So looking at this, you'll see our corporate overview. We have a valuation of around about $22 million, and we have $5 million in the bank as of end of June. So pre-money, $16 million company. We have some very significant shareholders there. Will Garner is our number one and our founder. We have a lot of shareholders as part of Citicorp. I'm there at number 3. I purchased all my shares on either on market or in the IPO at 2 cents, which is pretty much where the share price is today. I didn't get any special favors in doing that. And there's number 5 and 6. If anyone recognizes the name Janssen Pharmaceutica, you may well have heard of Mr. Herwig Janssen, who was actually the founder of the son of the founder of Janssen Pharmaceutica. His father was Dr. Paul Janssen. And so whenever you see the name Janssen anywhere in the world, that's Herwig's father's name. So Herwig has put $500,000 into our IPO, and his brother-in-law is the person that follows him, and that he is married to Herwig's sister, Yasmin Janssen. So the Janssens are putting $1 million between them into our IPO, which means we have some fairly solid support. And Herwig has worked within business development for the past 30 years with Johnson & Johnson. And I myself have worked with Herwig directly in licensing and acquisition for 3 years. So I know him extremely well. We have a really good team of people. The 2 or the 3 at the bottom there, and the first 3 in the scientific advisory board, I'd like to discuss very briefly. Robin Carhart-Harris, who in the last 30 years is seen as the greatest mind when it comes to identifying exactly how psychedelics change that entropic brain, and how it can actually improve symptoms from your default mode network, and how it can change things around and reorder itself to help you get over conditions that you never thought you would be able to. You can never see the other end. And it's got a lot of good data in there, and an amazing study that takes quite a while to read. 2 more recent people, Professor David Castle and Professor Philippa Hay. They are both Australia's experts in body dysmorphic disorder with OCD, schizophrenia and bipolar in terms of Professor Castle. And Professor Philippa Hay, she's a globally recognized expert on eating disorders across the spectrum. And certainly with looking at binge eating disorder and anorexia nervosa, she's the most cited professional in Australia when it comes to those 2 things. I very quickly want to just jump into the amount of interest in psychedelics. So this is actually in psilocybin. You can see the number of studies you have going. You have 300 of them here. And it's just too many now. But will these actually lead to something that gets filed with a regulatory authority? The answer is no, because at least 60% of these are using mushrooms, and the TGA is not going to approve mushrooms, no matter how much people try. It's not going to. They want to approve a molecule. They want to approve a synthesized molecule that works. So even using psilocybin, when you take psilocybin, you get metabolism through the liver. It takes a long time to start to work. And because of that, you get 4-fold difference in one patient to the next. So one patient may get a very high dose of psilocin. One patient may get a very low dose of psilocin when they take that psilocybin capsule. And that's really the reason why it's so important when you look at how you should treat these patients with an opportunity here. And you're looking at 8 to 10 hours versus 1 to 2 hours when you use an IV infusion of psilocin. And this 8 to 10 hours involves at least 2 of those hours being sitting and watching that patient, sitting and watching them and waiting what's going to happen. You don't know what's going to happen. You don't know what dosage they're going to get. You don't even know if it's going to work for them. And at least 30% of the time, you do not get an effect when you have oral psilocybin. And you don't know what variability each patient has when they take that product. As I said, a 4-fold difference in variability. And there is a reason for that. There's this, what we have termed the ideal therapeutic window, or the Goldilocks window, for lack of a better word. And we've identified this as being the dosage point where most people will reach a psychedelic state or a neuroplastic state. And neuroplastic state means that you have the ability to make new neural connections in the brain. And most of us grew up knowing that what you have in your brain is what you're going to have forever. That is no longer the case. Because when neuroplasticity is used, and these products are classified as neuroplastic agents or neuroplastogens, which means they do allow growth of new neurons and expansion of nerves in the brain that people did not expect to see. This is the ideal therapeutic window. If you look at the dosage here of product, this is equivalent in terms of psilocybin. And this means about 25 milligrams for someone of my sort of weight, which is 80 kilos. Therefore, this is what you'll get. And this is 9 patients. This was the dosage that was average, but you can see 30% of these people fell outside the ideal therapeutic window, and 40% jumped outside of that on the upper level. So the biggest issue was, let's just increase the dose. Let's give them more, because give them more, it's bound to be better. So let's give them an equivalent of 37.5 or even 50, double the dose of psilocybin, and let's see what happens. The problem is what happens is it's very hard for fast metabolizers to get inside the ideal therapeutic window. So this does not change. But what does change is the immense amount of side effects that come outside of here. So if there was a way to maintain therapy within this window for all patients, then there would be something special that we could actually deliver. And that just looking at this one chart here, I'm sorry, I don't want to bore people. Just keep your focus on this just for a second. Don't stop watching, just keep watching. Okay, here it is now. This is what happens when you give 22 patients a 25 milligram capsule of psilocybin. Whenever you look at pharmaceutical technology, you always like to see a lovely black line that says everyone is fine. Look at that. That's a perfect curve. What happens when you give 22 people the same thing is you get a multitude of lines. Some people, they don't get any benefit at all. They reach a peak here, they reach a peak here, they reach a peak here. This is your 30% that don't get a response. So you can imagine that paying $10,000 or $20,000 for a treatment and knowing 3 in 10 aren't going to get a response is not going to be very happy for people. You get people who are fast metabolizers and they jump straight up. And then within an hour or half an hour, they're reaching a state, but then they drop down so quickly and they want to go home. But the thing is, they can't go home because there are some people that reach a state in 4 hours and then drive out this way. So the average is 8 to 10 hours that people have to wait. And that's about $10,000 in time of psychiatrists alone in that time. So how do you put them into what we call this therapeutic zone? So imagine when we actually do that. Time basis, you can see here what happens over time. Most people reach a psychedelic state or a neuroplastic state on oral psilocybin in between 2 and 3 hours. But if you can imagine what will happen if you can give people an exact dose, 10, 20, or 30, how we measure this is in nanograms per mil of psilocin, which is the actual active ingredient. So imagine rather than getting all of this mess, you can actually say, well, here's your subtherapeutic dose. This is where we believe the main dose of the therapeutic zone is. Within this, you're allowed to adjust if you're a physician, but this is what you can get. And if you want an upper dose, this is what you can get. So you have a distinct understanding of where every patient will be. You know where they're going to get to, and you know what you should expect from every one of those patients. And that is why using IV technology, where you can measure these things and know exactly how long it takes to keep them within that zone, is actually a very good thing to do. How am I going for time there, Ryan?
You got absolutely plenty of time. No stress.
All right. Hopefully enough people are still interested. I'll run you through the trial pipeline. So if you get the concept of what we're trying to do, most of you would then say, wow, if you can get something done in 8 times faster to reach a neuroplastic state, 4 or 5 times faster to get this treatment done, so you can do 5 patients in one day if you're a psychiatrist versus 1 patient, we can see the value and commercialization opportunity there for that. Let's take you through the studies, and I'll start with TYP 8802. This is an oral synthetic psilocybin. The reason why we use this product as our starting point is because we wanted to understand the pilot technology. Does psilocybin work when we know that it has to be metabolized into psilocin, which then goes to the brain and does the work? So if oral synthetic psilocybin will work, we are pretty sure that will de-risk having actual psilocin being put straight from the bloodstream into the brain. So this was our first cabs off the rank, 3 studies, one of which was completed back in October of last year with University of Florida. We still have update readings to come out for 6 months and 12 months after dosing with that. Fibromyalgia was the one that was completed most recently, which was really exciting. We had 100% of patients actually experience a reduction in pain. And then we have one ongoing right now with Massachusetts General Hospital looking at irritable bowel syndrome. One of those things that everyone who's ever asked me a question around treatment with psychedelic pharmaceuticals would say, I understand a bit about binge eating. I understand why fibromyalgia, being a nociplastic or a neuropathic pain, may do something, but how is it going to work in irritable bowel syndrome? And that's the question that we're going to be asking, along with Harvard, who really want to have that question answered. So once we get those phase 2A studies finished, we're moving into our TRP 8803 study. Now, this is our proprietary infused synthetic psilocin. Not only do we have protection around the crystalline salt that we use for psilocin, because psilocin in itself is extremely unstable. It lasts for less than 24 hours in nature, which is why nature tends to convert it to psilocybin, because it needs to be protected. But you want to have a better product, you got to then take it back to psilocin and make a crystalline salt to make it stable. Now we have that, and that will be proprietary. We are also the only company that can deliver an IV infusion over a 2-hour period, whether with psilocybin or with psilocin or with any other derivative that comes from any of those. We own that. That is going to be our tech globally. And we also have the ability to launch first into all these indications. Again, others cannot do this. We can. We can launch into binge eating disorder, fibromyalgia, or irritable bowel syndrome, where our competitors cannot, because we are the only company globally that has the ability to do so, because we're the ones that had the idea and we're going after it first. So let's talk a bit about the 8803 study, the first study that had ever been done in the world looking at an IV infusion in volunteers. And actually, we had no trouble getting a number of volunteers wanting to put their hand up either, which was really good. We had to go through a very rigorous screen to make sure they were indeed human and they were indeed volunteers. So it was very important that we do that. I was actually at 4 of the 11 patients that were dosed. I went to CMAX in cohort 1, in cohort 2, and in cohort 3. And it was remarkable to be there in the room and watching on a screen whilst the subject went through this process. And I have to say, I was expecting something more significant in terms of the way people respond, the therapy that might be required, heard so much about. The treatment itself requires absolutely no therapy. And it's a very inward journey. People put their blindfolds on, they lay back, and they're very still. And they just go through that process for like an hour and a half. They are there and they're still and they're quiet. And there's no guidance. There's no therapy needed during that itself. The only time we need therapy is preparing them for the study and then integrating them after the study. But during the therapy itself, the beauty of psilocybin and the beauty of psilocin is it's such an inward journey. You don't want to tell everyone about your problems. You don't want to tell everyone about your trauma. You want to go through it yourself. And that's why it's such a tremendous drug and considered to be the gold standard when it comes to treatment-resistant depression and PTSD, because people are afraid to talk about their trauma. And when you're open and when you're taking something that makes you euphoric, you may in fact talk about that, but then would you feel guilty afterwards? And that's why we think psilocybin and psilocin is the best possible way to treat those 2 conditions. And we will be looking at moving into those 2 conditions in the future. So where are we right now? We're actually ahead of the game in terms of where we said we would be. We're looking at completion of the phase 1 trial. We expected that in H2. We are there now. We'll have more data coming. Safety review has to happen now. We have a lot of amazing brain scan data that we can't wait to present once we get all of that analyzed, and PK blood data, which was so important to find where that ideal period is that people will reach that neuroplastic state and stay there for the right amount of time. We have a lot of interim data coming through around fibromyalgia, and we're looking at phase 2 trial authorizations for 8803, which is IV-infused psilocin. We're looking at doing those in the first half of 2025. We are going to try and do eating disorder, and if we can, we'll try and do fibromyalgia earlier than this. It will depend on a couple of things coming through to us, R&D tax concessions and things like that, which we'd like to make sure we can push through and get as much done as we can. Okay. How are we going for time, Ryan? Are we pushing up against it?
Again, we've got plenty of time, so just take it as you will.
Okay, no problem. I just want to talk briefly about the conditions that not many people understand, and when they understand how much how effective we can be with our product in these conditions, you might understand a little bit more about just why it's so important. I mean, fibromyalgia, for those that have never heard of it, it's a widespread pain, usually covering all 4 quadrants of the body and always causing sleep disturbance, profound fatigue, numerous other symptoms. As they brain fog, or as it's commonly called, fibro fog, is one of the hardest. And often these fibromyalgia can begin after some sort of physical or emotional trauma in such an illness, a surgery, an infection, a life event, or an injury. So even though you may have forgotten about these things many years ago, it may have gone through a trauma, which could have been anything from a difficult childbirth all the way through to broken arms and legs. So these things can happen over many years, and your fibromyalgia pain feels like it's coming from a specific area of your body, even though there might be no physical pain in that body, because it's actually originating from the brain, actually from the nervous system. And therefore, if your brain makes that pain real, it's real. So trying to break that loop of pain is something that we believe, and we think we have now shown, that psychedelic pharmaceutical can actually do. A lot of increased suicide risk in people that have fibromyalgia because they no longer feel like part of society. Depression, health-related anxiety, and sleep disturbance just add to the agony of this particular disease. So and people can have this for 3 months, or they can have it for 20 years. It can be a lifelong experience. So having a product, and this is our data we just released a couple of weeks ago, that can actually deliver pain reduction in 100% of patients, as well as treating pain severity, sleep, having pain interfering with your life, having increases in lessening of fatigue, increasing in sleep, increasing in physical activity, and participating in daily social activities, as well as improved cognitive abilities and a reduction in fear or anxiety over pain. These things have never been seen in one product before. People spend enough time taking 720 tablets over a 3-month period to try and look after these myriad symptoms. And all we gave people was 2 doses of TYP 8802, 2 weeks apart. And that's all they had. So you think about the comparison between one and the other. It's immense, and it's immense. And the last one I'll talk about very briefly is irritable bowel syndrome. Affects 10 to 15% of people worldwide. It's about 800 million people, obviously many people in Australia. A lot of people don't go to work because of this particular issue. And interestingly enough, very, very associated with fibromyalgia, very associated with chronic fatigue, depression, and anxiety. Are you seeing the loop here? There are about 20 different conditions in mental health, all of which connect around PTSD, around depression, and these are peripheral issues. But often there's a central point that everything bounces off of, which tends to be depression. So if you can fix irritable bowel syndrome, you tend to make depression much, much easier. The same way we look at when we look at binge eating disorder. Binge eating we haven't talked about very much because we launched on the basis of having this binge eating disorder data, but it's something we never really talked about that much. People don't think of binge eating disorder as being a real mental disorder, but 94% have lifetime psychiatric disorders. 59% have depression, 32% have PTSD, and 23% of people with binge eating disorder have attempted suicide in their life. So in terms of being able to treat binge eating disorder, this is what I mentioned to you before. This is over the last 24 hours, how many times have you given what other people would regard as a highly unusually large amount of food? And the other side is, how many times did you feel that you lost control of your eating at the time that you're eating? So they know when this happens, but you can see the difference. Number of events per day, whether it's 2 events per day, whether it's half an event per day, you can see this reduction in every single patient. And we didn't expect to see anything more than 30 or 40% response. We saw a 100% response, and we all saw it at a fairly equivalent level, as well as for those that felt like they were in or out of control. In control, again, you're looking at somewhere between 62 and 100% times they're in control. Okay, durable, over 75 to 90 days. This was just one single dose taken at this point. This is where they started. They had 4 weeks of therapy, no change. Given the drug, they had a massive change. And that change was durable out to a 3-month time period, as was depression and as was anxiety, as measured by the Hospital Anxiety and Depression Scores Index. So you're looking at a 60+% reduction in depression. You're looking at a 30 to 40% reduction in anxiety. And this is just with one single dose of 8802. So you can see the opportunity that we have before us. We're very, very excited about it. We have patents covering all the work that we're doing. We believe we're extremely undervalued. And if anyone wants any further information, then they can certainly contact me, and I can send this. I'm sure this deck will go out as part of this presentation, but I really want to thank Ryan for the opportunity to speak today.
Well, thank you very much for the presentation, Jason. I found it very informative and very interesting. In fact, it's certainly something that a lot of companies in the ASX certainly don't come across on a frequent basis. Now, before we just get stuck into the the nitty gritty of the Q&A today, I'd love it if you could just touch on your background in the industry and what really drew you to tryptamine.
Yeah, sure. I mean, I've been working in pharmaceuticals almost since I was out of bounds. I finished my degree when I was 17. I moved to South Australia and went to Flinders University, did organic chemistry, loved it. I love chemistry, love everything about it, but realized not many CEOs come from chemistry. So by the time I spent 5 years working in operations, manufacturing facility of pharmaceuticals, I was lucky to be the youngest production manager of a pharmaceutical facility by the age of about 22. I decided to go into sales and marketing, and I knew that was where most of the people that get promoted tended to be. So I took that decision, which was hard for an introvert, to move into sales and marketing. I did that for a number of years, worked into then marketing at Bristol Myers Squibb, then transferred over to Johnson & Johnson or Janssen Pharmaceuticals in OTC. I spent a number of years there. Bigger and bigger roles, became sales and marketing manager of OTC, marketing director of primary care, and then sales and marketing director of Janssen Australia, before going overseas to the US, worked in biologics for 3 years in licensing and acquisition, building the Remicade business with the US team, and that increased from about $500 million to $3 billion within the 3-year period. Wow. And then did a global forecast for a product called Stellara. We forecast about a $4 billion product, and I think last year it did 10. So that was the end, the final year of it, but it actually did very, very well. Came back, worked in Australia again, licensing and acquisition for Asia Pacific and the region, and I saw a number of deals, including Imbruvica, including Zytiga. We actually had a number of big deals at that time that created between 10 and $25 billion in global sales. And from there, just led companies. I led the Philippines business for Janssen for 3 years, was then asked to join the Vietnam team and lead 5 different Johnson & Johnson companies in Vietnam with 1,000 employees and no Vietnamese. And then I went back after the birth of my daughter to go back to the Philippines and run over pharmaceuticals as managing director for the last 6 years before joining Tryp. And I really joined Tryp because I saw data I hadn't seen in that 34 years. I couldn't understand anything could actually help a binge eating disorder sufferer. And I just thought about, what about all the other eating disorder sufferers that we can potentially treat? And that was the way I felt like I could help the most people. So that's why I came to Tryp at the end of all of that career, and moved out of the top 200 J&J exec and decided to go back and do something that I thought would really add value to people rather than just adding value to myself.
Yeah, mate, that's absolutely incredible. Bloody hell. All right, well, let's actually get into the nitty gritty now. Now, obviously, you guys touched on the global interest in psilocybin accelerating, right? But can you give an indication on how psychiatrists are viewing the use of psychedelics as a treatment method holistically and globally?
Yeah, I think I can speak for a number of psychiatrists that I've spoken to, and they are cautiously excited about the opportunity. I think they're a little bit scared because the TGA haven't yet made any decision apart from to say if a psychiatrist wants to take the risk with that patient, then they can get authorization and they can prescribe them psilocybin or MDMA. But what that means is that that psychiatrist takes all of the legal risk
Yeah.
on the patient they introduce this to. So if something goes, the TGA, I mean, they don't have anything to do with it because they haven't approved a single product. They haven't approved
Yeah.
these for use. All they've said is someone else takes the hit, then we'll allow you to take that responsibility as a psychiatrist. And I think a lot of people are still scared because all they see right now is people that are paying $30,000. They're getting put behind locked doors for 90 days in some sort of communal setting, and we don't know what they're being given. We don't know what comes
Yeah.
out the other side. So our methodology is so opposed to that treatment. We want to make sure that we bring these products legitimacy and provide the pharmaceutical backing that we know these are. This is pharmaceutical tech. This is a
Yeah.
pharmaceutical product that has great changes that can be made in the brain. It doesn't need to be administered behind closed doors. It just does not. And we are making sure we're going to bring it out in front of everyone, including the TGA.
Oh, brilliant. Well, thank you for the update there. Now, in regards to the current use of oral psilocybin as a treatment method, has the time frame and uncertainty been a barrier to the use of practitioners and patients?
If you talk to the physicians who have been part of clinical trials, which is where most of the oral psilocybin has been used, then I've heard the words paint dry, looking out the window for the grass to grow, and for any movement in the patient.
Yeah.
And it does take a long time, but I know that the people, say that the doctors in Massachusetts General Hospital, they are legitimately excited about being part of the study, and they're okay to sit there for 10 hours while they wait for something to happen
Yeah.
because they know they're excited. It's the first time I've done a study. But you imagine doing this day in, day out, when you've got 10 hours as a psychiatrist, you can see 10 patients in that time. And we are so short of psychiatrists in Australia
Yeah.
to actually look after patients, that having one patient for a whole day it's just not going to be commercially scalable. So, and a patient can take 4 hours to reach a state. And when they do reach that state, the patient variability you get with any oral dose means you may get no effect, where people say, when do I get to go home? Or you may get such a large amount of psilocin active at that time that they go through an extremely panicked and traumatic experience, which is why you need someone watching them all the time.
Yeah.
You don't get that with IV. So oral makes that decision to jump into therapy so much harder than it otherwise should be. And that's why we think we found an opportunity for that to happen. Bring this thing out in the open and allow doctors to really see how an effective treatment should take place with patients.
Okay. Okay. And now touching on the topic of IV, you'll have to excuse my ignorance here. But how does an infusion actually work? Does the solution read patient blood levels in real time and administer the psilocybin solution accordingly, or is it something a little bit different to that?
Yeah, it's certainly within a laboratory setting. I mean, we're doing studies at the moment where we actually have patients getting an infusion, and we take blood at certain times, so we can get
Yeah.
a pharmacokinetic blood level or concentration at certain time points every 15 minutes or so throughout the infusion. But in terms of, we know the amount of time it takes for psilocin to exit the body. It's about 1.8-hour half-life. So all we have to do is make sure that within the infusion, we set people up to the right dose in a short period of time, and then we
Yeah.
give them enough dose to replace the amount that they'll be losing by metabolism over time. And that's really the secret to what we're doing. So no, blood levels won't have to be taken in real
Yeah.
time when it comes to the patient at the end. It's really just a little syringe. It's not very much product. It's 1
Yeah.
mil. So overall, it's 20 mils over 20 minutes. So it's really not scary. And if anyone's had a tooth out and they use a little propofol, they'd know exactly what that's like, a small injection, and then they just know that something good is happening and that they come back and they've lost a tooth. And that's exactly the same thing. It's technology in IV and anesthesiology, of course, as well. You don't want to have a tablet when you're having an appendectomy. You don't want to say, well, you've woken up and have this tablet. In 30 minutes, you'll start to feel comfortable again, and we'll keep the surgery going. That's why IV is so well appreciated and well known. And I think that we'll be able to deliver that message to make sure doctors and patients feel comfortable using it.
Okay. Now, just shifting back to some of your previous experiences, obviously, with your previous experience in the larger pharmaceutical industry and some of these companies, right, what have been some of the barriers to entry for these larger companies into the psychedelic drug development?
Yeah, you would have thought if they wanted to enter, they would have jumped in already. And I think they didn't realize just how difficult that was. A lot of fringe medicine had been happening for, I mean, as the MAPS team would say, for 38 years. And yet, what I say to that is, if the pharmaceutical industry had had this product 38 years ago, we would have had a product on the market probably 25 years ago, because the study and the process would be so different, rather than the subjective, the pressure, the way in which the tactics get used versus actually trying to find the data which will actually excite the TGA. Because I know that the TGA are looking for a solution. They know we have a growing opioid epidemic. We know we've got 2,300 people that had accidental overdoses with opioids and antidepressants in the last couple of years, and that's accelerating. They don't want mums and dads taking medications for their depression and then just dying. I mean, we don't want that to happen. 80% of deaths that are classified as suicide or accidental are actually accidental. They don't mean to die. So we can stop some of that. People with depression, with people with TRD, people with PTSD, we can help to prevent that. And I think pharmaceutical industry is kind of too late to the party, and they really have to find a phase 2 asset or a phase 3 asset if they choose to, and then come in with their checkbooks and open them up. Because AbbVie did that very thing with Gilgamesh, a phase 2 asset company. They had a couple of small molecules in phase 2A. They pulled together a licensing deal with them that, with milestones, came up to almost $2 billion. And that's a very small company, 65 million upfront, 1.98 billion in milestones. And that didn't even own the company. That's just a license. Assuming the product works, that's the company. And we have a company worth $20 million and we're in phase 2. And I can say in business development for 4 years, if I ever saw a company in phase 2 that was worth $20 million, that would be a very surprising thing indeed. So I find it quite remarkable that we're so lucky to be able to get. I want to buy more stock in my own company, of course, but I think it's great value, and that's what I'll be doing. So whether or not people invest with me or not, it doesn't matter, because I believe it's good value.
Okay. Well, thank you for the update in that regard. Now, obviously, I've done a lot of these webinars with pharmaceutical companies, and it does appear that a lot of, drug development does take a really long time to, set up, administer, and then get results from these drug trials. But Tryp seems to be able to complete them unseasonably fast at the moment. Now, realistically, why is this? And do you expect this trend to continue just for Tryp or to the broader market?
We don't like to waste any time. That's for sure. We want to get that signal quickly, which is why we use oral psilocybin. I mean, the company didn't just appear, in May out of nowhere as well. I mean, the company has been in operation since 2019, developing all the preclinical work, getting studies started within 3 INDs approved by the FDA to get 3 studies moving in the US, where they've been operating for a year and a half to get the data coming through now. So there was about $30 million that was actually spent on the organization long before it came to the ASX. So that value, that money that's been spent, means other companies who want to copy us have to copy that 3 years that happened before, which is why we're so far ahead of everyone now. Certainly in Australia, we're in front of everyone. And we believe we're leading the pack in terms of what we have to deliver and the way we're pulling our clinical studies together. So once we plan to do our phase 2 program, we are looking at ways with our partners, Lucid Healthcare, to whether or not we can look at how deep into phase 2 we can run. Can we run phase 2B? Can we hold phase 2B and then slash and move over to phase 3? It all depends on the TGA and what data they need from us, how many patients they need from us. And we're already in discussions with them even before we start our phase 2 program in Australia. I think we just know how to get things done. We know what we want, and we have a pathway to success. And it's not as though we haven't done this before. I've got things approved in 4 different countries with 4 different regulatory authorities and got reimbursement. So it's not as though it's a difficult thing to do. It's just making sure that you get the right data and you do it the right way, so we don't have any more issues within the psychedelic space that have happened recently.
Yeah. Brilliant. Okay, well, thank you for the update there. Now, just one more from me before we move on to participant questions. Now, just on the topic of some market news, when you like realistically expect to be able to release the full results from the recent TRP 8803 trial, and how do you reckon these results are going to impact the company's next steps?
Thanks, Ryan. They're going to impact us significantly, because when you're looking at 11 people, the first 11 people in the world that have been given an infusion, I mean, the data that we're going to gain from those 11 patients or those 11 subjects is going to be quite remarkable. We'll use that data for patents. We'll use that data to identify what's the exact appropriate range that we can go within when it comes to using an IV infusion of psilocin. We'll have their brain scan analysis, and we'll see what electrical activity is happening within the brain. So we'll be able to talk about where we believe that patient or that subject has reached a level of neuroplasticity, where the healing part of what the whole process will start to happen. And to be able to identify that is extremely rare. That just doesn't happen. People are given a tablet, and then what happens. We'll be able to know exactly when that point happens. And that's the exciting part of precision medicine in this space. And it's something that it's never been seen before. So, and everything we go from here flows on from this study, because it'll all be IV infusion all the way from us from here.
Yeah, of course. Okay, well, thank you for the update now. So, just moving on to some live participant questions here. The first one I've got is, I'm with Starlight Clinical Research, a research site in Colorado, focusing on psychedelic studies. We are curious about what challenges you face with site selection.
Yeah, site selection is extremely hard. Thanks for the question. We actually chose a very high-level clinical research site for our first IV study globally, and that was a company called CMAX in Adelaide, an extremely professional team, and they specialize in early clinical and phase 1 studies. So we decided to go that way because we really wanted to make sure we had exacting data, especially because we were looking at EEG data as well as the full pharmacokinetic profile. And that just enabled us to go through and get the right patients at the right times. And it was our best way of doing it. But whether we do a phase 2 program that way, I am probably a little more partial to looking at a university to run our phase 2 program once we have the data from a pure clinical setting. But that was the most difficult part. And then how to make sure you can mix, when you're bringing in a drug that's still not scheduled, you have to then turn that into a solution and then inject that into people. So the process of going through the unscheduled to S9 status is still something that took a little bit of time. But we did cover everything. HREC was not an issue for us. They saw the study protocol. They were really impressed. And the safety committee ran through the study, cohort 1 and 2, were approved to move forward to cohort 3. And they did that very efficiently within a week of each cohort being done. So we were really impressed with that.
Okay. Now, just on the topic of site selection, we've got another one here. A participant asked which hospitals will be targeted for the Australian eating disorder trial and how many patients will be recruited.
That's a good question. We're looking at a number of sites that we can potentially do these studies in. The phase 2 program is likely to be around about 12 patients, and looking at 2 doses within those 12 patients, so 6 and 6. The idea then being that if we can show that our product works in binge eating disorder for 12 patients and we get a really good response with that, we can then talk to the TGA as to whether we can roll that phase 2B trial into a phase 3 trial to build more data in order to get an approval. So we haven't earmarked any specific hospitals yet. We are currently going through that review process, and we'll actually be talking to our board in September as to some recommendations, which studies, which hospitals we would like to target.
Well, thank you for the update on that one. Now, another participant asked if there was an 80% reduction in binge eating disorder using oral psilocybin. Why is there a need for this trial to be done on a larger scale with IV administration? Further, is the data in the phase 2 trial strong enough to request accelerated approval from the FDA?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I appreciate it. The way we've used oral psilocybin is really as a pilot program, because we understand the delivery of an oral mechanism of product through the liver, metabolism that goes on around about 18% of what you have in an oral capsule of psilocybin will become free psilocin, as well as 5 or 6 other metabolites that get made, that get excreted out. So you just get that free psilocin. Now, when we show that free psilocin will work, we have to then look at what happens when you inject into the bloodstream directly, psilocin that goes straight from the bloodstream straight into the brain without metabolism or without first pass metabolism. We just weren't sure just exactly how patients would accept it, because it had never been done before. We had seen what happens when patients get injected with a bolus of psilocybin, and it's not pleasant. It's a lot of nausea, a lot of vomiting, a lot of very, very traumatic patients that are being seen. So that was over a 6-minute period or so. We knew an infusion is longer. Therefore, we made sure that 20 or 30 minutes that we could have for an ongoing infusion had to be right. And what we can do now that we've done 2 studies, we have an answer on for oral. We have one more that we're doing with Harvard on oral for IBS. Once we get data on that, if we get 3 yeses overall, I don't believe we'll ever have to do an oral psilocybin trial again, because we have what we believe to be a better asset, and we can take everyone's oral psilocybin trials, of which there are hundreds, and we can pick and choose the conditions that we wish to go into with IV. We don't have to stop, but yet others can't copy us because we have the coverage on IV, but we can copy them because we know how to use oral therapy already. So there's benefits for us to doing it the way we have done it.
Okay, thank you for that one. Now, just moving on, given your experience with IBD, do you think IBD could be a potential indication as well as IBS?
Yeah, inflammatory bowel disease is a multifactorial issue. And yes, I have worked with that a lot around Remicade, around Stelara, around Symphony. And it does have its own issues. So you're looking at not just inflammatory conditions, you're looking at psoriasis, you're looking at psoriatic arthritis. There are a multitude of factors there. So we haven't yet identified as to whether there is a gut-brain axis that will really cater with serotonin. Obviously, using a monoclonal antibody for these things like Remicade or like Symphony, yes, you certainly treat that immunoreaction. We do know there are some anti-inflammatory properties with psilocybin and psilocin. So theoretically, there may be some opportunity there, but it's really well catered market right now with some very, very powerful drugs from all the way from Humira onto Remicade onto Symphony and Stelara. It's not something that we want to jump into. But ulcerative colitis and Crohn's disease and things like that, I mean, maybe we're looking at those in a few years from now, because it'd be nice to know. And things like long COVID, things like chronic fatigue syndrome, I see the symptoms of fibromyalgia and I align them with long COVID. I align them with chronic fatigue syndrome, and maybe there's some neural component in those. Phantom limb would be another one. I'd see us looking more in that direction before we take a look probably at really true IBD conditions, which can be really multifactorial and very difficult to treat.
Okay, well, thank you for that. Now, just one more to finish us off. For TRP 8803, which indications, if any, will the company be looking for in order to attempt to get accelerated approval, i.e. post positive results for phase 2A and phase 2B?
Yeah, that's my favorite question. I have arguments over that question every meeting. I would like to do as many as I can, to be honest. And the only thing holding us back is obviously the amount of activity we said we'd spend during our IPO. and that is one study at a time in a sequential fashion. But right now, based on what we know about oral psilocybin, certainly binge eating disorder makes sense. Certainly fibromyalgia, especially now, makes sense. Anorexia nervosa makes sense. Treatment-resistant depression makes sense. PTSD makes sense. And I hope that in a couple of months' time, we'll see that irritable bowel syndrome will also make sense. So if I had my way in a perfect world, I would run 6 studies in phase 2. But I know it's not a perfect world, and I don't live in one. I live in reality. But that would be my dream. Would be that we'll get these conditions treated as quickly as possible, and then really push for a view from the TGA at the end of a phase 2B program, and see how many more patients we would need to deliver before we can get a registration for those conditions. But that's my honest direction, and I don't normally say these things, but that's what I would love to do, but I just don't know whether I'll be able to do those things yet.
Okay, well, thank you very much. I'm sure the market will appreciate that one. Now, before we wrap things up, Jason, is there anything you'd like to leave us with?
I think this is a really great format, by the way, and I'm just grateful that I get a chance to talk about the product, as well as the science, as well as my background and love of that science. I love to see how things work, and I love to help what we're trying to do with patients. It's something I've spent my whole career trying to do, and I think the first time in 30 years where I really feel like the things that I do and the things that my team do will actually come through and help so many people. And I thank those people who already invested in us. And I really hope that there are some more that may consider investing in something that is one of the most exciting things to happen in neuropsychiatry in 50 years. And I don't say that lightly. I think this is going to change the world. And that's blue sky, so don't quote me. But I think this is going to change the world. But thank you very much, Ryan. I appreciate the time.
Well, thank you very much, Jason. It's absolutely brilliant. Well, thank you very much for your time and expertise this afternoon, Jason. Really appreciate it. And thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen, for your time. Enjoy the rest of your day.
Thank you.